Hello and welcome to What's on the Horizon. I'm Lori Sharonbrock and I'm here with Chris Schucker, owner of Digital Horizons. And today we are talking about service providers in the Brainerd Lakes area. So, our area in particular, as I'm sure are many other areas, have seen a big influx of new residents and people coming in. I'm on Nextdoor, and so I see people asking questions a lot like, who are the service providers? How do I choose? Where do I get internet? What is best for streaming? Things like that. So what is a good starting place to start giving people advice about where to go?
Well, as we were kind of talking about before this, there's often not a lot of options. And what I mean by that is the way the service providers typically work, because they have a lot of expenditure they have to do to bring service to an area, they tend to not overlap each other. So if you're in a neighborhood, you may only have one physical connection available. And what I mean by that is some sort of wiring in the ground, whether it's copper or fiber or something like that. So if you buy a house or build a house in an area, you're probably only going to have access to one provider, whether it's CTC, whether it's Spectrum or CenturyLink or TDS or SCI or whoever it might be in your area. So our recommendation is always just do the due diligence prior to, if you're looking for a home or you're building a home, know who the providers are in the area, and we'll put a link in the description below of like everybody that's in the general Brainerd area. But they'll typically have a website where you can go to punch in your address, and they'll tell you if service is available at your address and then what it is. Sometimes addresses aren't correct or they're off a little bit. And then they'll ask you to call in, and then the process of calling in will vary greatly based on who it is. It's awful if it's CenturyLink, and if it's CTC, it's great.
Yes.
So you kind of don't have a choice when it comes to a physical connection, and a physical connection is 100%, 1,000% the way you should go. Alternatives to that, we'll probably get into a little bit later, are doing cellular or maybe satellite or something like that. But yeah, going to those options are really the last ditch effort to getting service at your home. And if service is critical, it should be thought of before you buy the house or before you build the house.
Yeah, so that would be my next question is, like, let's say you're buying or building out on some acreage that perhaps doesn't have service out there yet. Do you still kind of have to find whose territory that is, or do you have some choice?
If there's no service there, or if you know who services the general area because you've done that homework of going to websites, your only option at that point is to reach out to whoever's nearby and see if they'll build out for you. And if they do, they charge significantly.
Yeah, I've heard that can be kind of expensive.
Yeah, and sometimes it's worth it.
Yeah.
I've heard stories, and I have clients who've paid tens of thousands of dollars to have service brought out to their home because it was a quarter mile up the road. And so then they'll work with the service provider, and obviously it's in provider's interest to bring service to that area, but they're not going to do it for free, and there's usually a negotiation involved, and the homeowner pays X amount, the provider pays X amount. If you're in an area that's a development or is going to be one, you might be able to get together with your neighbors and have a petition signed, and then go to the provider and say, hey, I have 15 neighbors, I have 20 neighbors, I have 30 neighbors, and maybe they'll bring it in for nothing, or everybody pays $500 or whatever. And then obviously, you would have to decide what that amount is, and if it's good enough for you or how you want to handle it. So, but yeah, that's really your only option if there is nothing there.
And like you said before, like, say it's too cost prohibitive. It's one of those things that you don't want to do.
Yeah.
What are those alternatives?
Buy a different house, building.
Find a new neighborhood.
And it sounds like I'm joking, but I'm actually kind of serious. I've had a number of instances of projects that we've gotten involved with where someone built a home, and unfortunately we get brought into the construction process a little later than we'd like to in a lot of cases. So by the time we get brought in, maybe the foundation's in or the walls are up, right? Which is I mean, that's fine. But if we're being contacted at that point, one of our early questions is, who's your service provider? And they go, well, we have no idea. And I just go, I'm so sorry. And if they have nothing, then the options are very limited. And I think if you're building a home or buying a home and internet is critical to you, you have to have a physical provider there to really get good service. And me personally, I've been kind of looking at homes myself, and if the home that I'm looking at doesn't have broadband service, I don't even consider it. It regardless of how many other check boxes it has, it's done. Yeah. If I don't have a physical provider there, I move on, because I don't want to go through the process of trying to do a build out, because that may not work. I don't want to deal with the other options that are available. So if there isn't a physical service provider where the home that I'm looking at, I'm not interested.
Yeah, I mean, and especially this last year has been super critical. So pre-March 2020, I worked from home. I've always worked from home. I was the only person working from home. Our kids were small. We didn't use much bandwidth. So the basic router that we got when we moved in was just fine. It was great for everything I needed. Well, then my husband's office closed and he worked from home. And then our kids came home.
Right, homeschool,
and we had 4 people on there, and it just wasn't even good enough. And so I think, a lot of the people coming new into the area, perhaps are remote working too. So, when you're working with a service provider, what options, do you start to need to talk about up front when it comes to internet, routers, networking?
I would say the hardware stuff is, it doesn't matter who your service provider. No, the hardware, the hardware doesn't care. It's, obviously that's a whole separate broad topic, but once you get the service in your home, the equipment doesn't care. It's like piping in your home.
Sure.
As long as you have water coming in, your pipes don't care what that water looks like, where it comes from, what it tastes like, if it's, whatever. Yep. So yeah, it really you just need to get service into the home, and having, again, a physical provider is best. And so on that topic, outside of physical providers, you're kind of left with 2 options. You do a cellular option, which is usually like a hotspot, or there are things called cellular modems.
Okay.
So traditional modem like you get from a cable provider or whatever, a little black box. They have a similar version to that, but the difference is it has a slot for a SIM card.
Okay.
So you add it to your plan, you get a SIM card, you plug it in, and then as long as that modem has good cell coverage or can get good cell coverage, then it can plug into a router and access points like we might set up just like any other service provider would. The drawback with cellular is your bandwidth is often limited. You can get pretty good speeds, but it's not as good. But then you have a lot of data caps. I don't care how many providers tell you they do unlimited, it's never actually unlimited. And when you're streaming, especially 4K content on Netflix or doing gaming or anything like that, the unlimited plan will run out extremely fast. Side topic, a lot of providers, physical providers like Charter and things like that, not so much in this area, maybe more in metropolitan areas where bandwidth is more limited. They have caps on their service. It might be a terabyte or it might be 10 terabytes, but a lot of those providers have bandwidth caps too. They're just not as known because most people don't hit them, but they're creeping down because as more of our lives are through the internet, they're going to try to capitalize on their ability to deliver that to you, and it will be through bandwidth caps. And so we'll start seeing it come down. If you remember 10 years ago when actual unlimited was available through cellular, and then all of a sudden unlimited went away, probably some collusion involved there, but everybody stopped offering unlimited plans and they went to data plans where it was 10, 20, 50, 100 gig. And now they're back to unlimited. And so that'll be the next frontier. So outside of cellular providers, your other options are satellite. Yeah. And up until recently, your only option for internet for satellite was through Exceed or Wild Blue, and there were 2 or 3 companies that have kind of jostled around a little bit. And it's really a last ditch. Like if that's your only option, it's unfortunate. It works okay. I'm a little torn on whether I recommend it over cellular. It really depends on how you're using it. But also there's data caps, there's bandwidth limitations. One of the drawbacks with satellite internet is because you are on the Earth and the satellite is in orbit. When you type in google.com, unlike a physical connection that's hardwired in, the path from your computer to that satellite, there's a lot of air and a lot of resistance.
No kidding.
So latency, which is the time it takes for a request from your computer to the satellite and to the server that you're trying to request information from, that's called the time it takes there is latency, is very, very high because it has to go up, however many miles up to the satellite, down to Google servers, back up to the satellite, and back down to you. So that latency, it's getting better, but that's kind of annoying when you're constantly going to websites and the information will get to you, but the time it takes to request it and send it back and get it is annoying.
I don't know a person on Earth who has that kind of patience.
Yeah.
To be really
unfortunately, a lot of people develop it because satellite internet's the only option.
The only way they can go.
Now, a recent development is something from SpaceX called Starlink.
Oh, yes. I've seen the videos of the Starlink satellites being released.
Right. Yep. So they are launching lots and lots of reusable rockets, which is crazy that they're able to do that. Mm-hmm. And they'll launch hundreds or thousands of these satellites at a time, and it creates a web in orbit so that the speed at which information goes between your computer and the server is greatly reduced. And they have very good bandwidth capabilities. It's still in beta, and people are, you have to deal with whatever growing pains are going along with it, but that's your most viable option for satellite internet. The way it works is you have an upfront cost of equipment, which I think is about $500. And then you have to have it installed. If you're not capable of doing so, it's a dish that mounts on your roof. You have to run a category cable from it into your home where your router will be, or their equipment in your router. So there's some upfront costs, but it's definitely your best option for anything else besides a physical connection. And I think going forward, it might rival a lot of physical connections, or at least it'll create some downward pressure on those providers that provide a physical connection to be, I don't want to say honest, but
I know what you mean.
Competition in the marketplace is always good. So, so that's kind of the wrap up. So,
earlier you had mentioned that there was a website that you can go to type in your address to find out what those.
Well, that all depends on the individual providers. So maybe we should cover the providers in the area.
Sure, that would be great.
So the primary one that if you have access to that if we're talking just strictly internet, which I think going forward is where everything is. Maybe it's a tier list. Maybe we start from the top down. So number one, 100% CTC, which is consolidated telephone or telecommunications company, and they're based out of Brainerd. They have offices in Baxter, kind of all over the place, and they have a huge ring of fiber optics across this area, like massive ring of fiber optics. So if you can get CTC, 100% for, and I'll probably just quickly touch on both from a service standpoint, but then also customer service, because that is huge too. They're nobody's close. So if you have the ability to buy a home or build a home in an area that's serviced by CTC, there's nobody in this area that comes close to the services that they offer. The actual quality of the internet is fantastic. The equipment they use is great, and then because they're local, if you have a problem, it's easy to call them. They have offices you can go to, you can get service, and then the pricing is very fair too. So I think CTC is so far and above and beyond everybody else that's in this area that if you have the ability to use them, it's a no-brainer. And then I would say next on the list is Spectrum, and I think largely because they're local because they have offices here. They're not a local company,
right?
But they're behind CTC as far as quality of internet and customer service. But if you have between those two, those are going to be your options, and then. In some areas around here, you have SCI, which is, I think their primary office is in, I'm not even sure. I want to say kind of in the Sandstone area, maybe is where their office is. But then they have a little bit of a service area in here in East Skull Lake and that type of stuff. And they're good too. I think the quality of service isn't as good as number one and number two, but service is probably better than Charter or Spectrum, surprisingly, even though they're not this isn't their main area. And then there's a sharp drop off because if you don't have access to those in this area, then you're really limited. And your kind of other two options are CenturyLink or TDS. And it's just it's unfortunate if that's who you have to use. I've rarely had an experience with customer service that is worse than any time I've ever dealt with CenturyLink or TDS. And so you're just, I'm very, very sorry if those, man, whenever we have a project that we're working on or a client has either of those service providers, it's just strap on for a wild ride. Yeah. So, I really don't have anything good to say about either of them. I'd say if those are your options over satellite internet, you might be okay. But yeah, it's just really too bad that if those are your only options.
Well, it goes back to what you said about planning ahead and doing a little bit of that legwork if you can before you build or buy or whatever to make sure you can get in with one of those preferred providers. It obviously makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And outside of that, more regional stuff that maybe isn't directly related to the Brainerd area, you might have some other cooperatives in the area. So like Crosslake Crosslake Communications, they have good service. I'd say they're pretty close to CTC or Spectrum in that range. And then, if you're in Emily, there's Emily Cooperative. If you're in Wadena, there's a cooperative there that does fiber. And I think you'd be better suited by any of those cooperatives than a Charter or a Spectrum or something like that. But those would be the three that we started with are going to be your best options in the Brainerd area for sure.
Yeah, I live in the Crosslake area, and I can't speak highly enough of Crosslake Communications. Their prices are reasonable, and their customer service is excellent. As I said earlier, once we had a big influx of everybody at home, we just made a simple phone call and they were like, here, come get this, or here, we can do this for you. And like you said, I think service is just so important, almost above anything else if they can do for you. I think that's great. So I can speak highly of them too.
Good to know.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us. And if anybody has any questions, how do they get a hold of you?
So they can visit our website, which is digitalhorizonsmn.com. Or you could call us at 218-330-4140.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the advice, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode.